Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA regulated company or its products, this is the podcast for you. Today's podcast is actually fascinating because we're going to land up talking about an area that I was previously involved in, but from a legal angle, but not quite in the same way because I was working at it from how do you change things in terms of behavioral choices and stuff like that, in specifically choosing certain types of healthcare practices. But I think Suzanne's going to get into it a little bit more. Our guest today is a behavioral scientist at BVA Nudge Unit, where she co-leads the healthcare division globally. So nothing fancy, just a global healthcare leader. Her passion lies in marrying the worlds of psychology, public health, and behavioral economics to craft impactful behavior changes across the healthcare ecosystem. Prior to joining the BVA Nudge Unit, she co-developed an industry-leading social science group at Global Marketing Network McCann Health. She completed her master's in public health from Columbia, where she enjoys returning to deliver visiting lectures on behavioral economics and choice architecture. So I don't know if you know this, but this reminds me of the meme where the guy's looking at this thing and he goes, "Yeah, I know some of those words," and that's how I feel right now. I've heard of behavioral economics and I've heard of choice architecture. I have no idea what those mean. So our guest for today, Suzanne Kirkendall. Hey, Suzanne, how are you?
Hey, Darshan, I'm good. How are you?
Good. So first of all, is it Kirkendall or Kirkendale? Or how do you
No,
pronounce
you got it right. Kirkendall. Thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So Suzanne, let's talk a little bit about just what you're doing, first of all. Let's start at the top line. We can kind of go from there. So could you talk about your experience, your work as a behavioral scientist? What does that mean?
Yes. No, I was going to start with those definitions because you're definitely not alone. I think vast majority of people I talk to at work are about the same place. I've heard of those words. I don't know exactly what that means. And outside of work, I'm lucky if people have heard those words. So don't feel alone at all. So behavioral economics, behavioral science, all of this are kind of extensions of what I simply define as kind of understanding how people really make decisions and how people really process the world, and then how they really truly act on those behaviors ultimately. And so when I emphasize how they really make decisions, this goes back to where behavioral economics came from, which is traditional economics, which a lot more people have heard of. Traditional economics was founded on theories that assume that people are perfectly rational. And right, you're laughing already.
Yeah.
We know just from common sense that's probably not true, but that's how a lot of the field was developed. And so behavioral economics started to branch off from traditional economics when we had a few radical folks like, Daniel Tversky, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman branching off and saying, hold on, that's not quite right. So that's where the field of behavioral economics came from, is saying, okay, how do real people actually make decisions and subsequently behave? Choice architecture is kind of the part two of that. So there's the part one of understanding how people behave, which is, psychology, social psych, behavioral economics, neuroscience, all of those collective behavioral science fields. And then there's the part two of choice architecture, which is where you start to say, okay, so I know how people are really making decisions. How do I now influence those decisions to be, the best ones possible in, what we talk about at BVA Nudge Unit as ideally a win-win-win situation. So it's the best situation for, in our case, the company that we're working with, the best situation for the target audience that we're trying to move along, and the best situation for society as a whole. So we do a lot of work on sustainability, equity, that sort of stuff. But anyway, so choice architecture is all about how do I shape the moment of decision, the context around that decision, to make it as easy as possible for this person to make the best choice. So a lot of it is around removing friction. We're not making anybody do anything. This is not super nefarious. Not nefarious at all. And it's all about removing friction. So, the book that made behavioral economics and Nudge really, really well known, kind of in the pop psych space, was called Nudge, by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, that came out a bit over 10 years ago now. And, Richard Thaler says, if I need to summarize that book, my 3-word summary is make it easy. That's what we're doing. We're making it easy.
God, I have so many questions. I'm just taking notes down as I go through this. Let's start with the first question. By the way, I already have a question to ask you, so I'm waiting for that to get through some of the basics before we go down Dinesha's question. But you talk about nudge and you say making it easy. This is the exact opposite of my experience around payment in healthcare. We talk about formulary committees. We talk about stepwise processes that help people avoid a certain product, or at least go through other products before a certain product is chosen. So, for example, if your doctor wants to use X drug, well, have you tried A, B, and C first? If you get through A, B, and C, then we'll talk about X drug. When I spoke to people in the PBM space, they go, that's a way of reducing cost. You add a little bit of friction, and that makes people sort of choose something else. Are you saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, are you saying that that's inefficient, or are you saying it doesn't work?
So whether or not it quote unquote works depends on what your ultimate goal is, right?
Okay.
So if you're the person designing this choice context, you got to think about your goal. And so this is going to get into a whole talk about where is the right place to involve a behavioral scientist, right? And, I just read an article this morning talking about, there are kind of 4 roles that a behavioral scientist can play in an organization. Often we think about them as kind of that, what's called that last mile, which is just, how do we modify the copy we already have to be more convincing? Or, how do we redesign the shelving in the store so that people select our product? That's the last mile. But you can have people involved all the way up at the beginning with your strategy, right? Your business strategy, your product strategy, and making sure you're infusing behavioral science understanding then. And so when we're having conversations with clients about these sorts of things, it does come back to this goal, right? What is the goal? What's your business strategy? If your business strategy is we need to reduce usage so that we aren't overwhelmed or so that we can control costs, then you're going to want to maybe add some friction. If your strategy is, I want as many people to have as easy and quick access to this product, this drug, this medical service as possible, then you're going to want to take friction away. So it becomes very, very specific about what exactly is your target behavior for your very specific target audience. And then that's where you can start to craft the solutions that are going to fit the best.
So first of all, I just want to make sure I understand. So what you're saying is sometimes the behavior is, so if my behavior is I want you to choose X and not Y, you make the process to Y more difficult and the process to X easier. And that is a way of quote unquote nudging them. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. Yep.
Okay. So let's take the next question. So if you are, and again, just to be clear, we're not talking on legal advice. We're also not asking about specific situation-based questions. These are going to be very specific. And if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to Suzanne. Suzanne, by the way, where can they reach you if they have questions as we continue?
Yeah, I love questions. I love talking about this stuff, as you're seeing already. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you're welcome to email me at suzanne.kirkendall@bvanudgeunit.com. And I'm sure those will be in the show notes somewhere as well. But LinkedIn is quick and easy too.
Exactly. So when we're talking about one of the big questions we need to deal with, and this is a big question in pharma that we've been dealing with for ages, is, and I am a horrible example of this, so I will admit to this, even though I'm a pharmacist by training, I don't like taking my medications. I know I'm supposed to take my medications. I know it's supposed to be helpful, but I just, somehow it just doesn't make me, I don't know, it doesn't even, like, it's not the adverse events, it's sort of just forgetting to take it, or maybe I'll take it in an hour and take it another hour and just forget about it. So can nudging help with that process? Is that something that, because it's a problem people have been solving. So how do you help people make that decision?
Yeah, medication adherence is often called like the $1 billion question in pharma because it's huge. It's a huge impact on people's health, and it's a huge impact on business if people aren't using the medications that they're prescribed. And this is actually how I got started in public health and behavior science. One of my first research studies that I was involved in when I was still more on the academic side was a medication adherence study. And as soon as you start diving into it, you find that it is much more complicated than people think about it on the surface, right? You mentioned forgetting, and usually people think that forgetting is like the only problem to be solved. And so all of the surface level interventions are designed to remind. Mm-hmm. And that when you do actual studies and look at the research on the actual causes of what's going on there, that's only a fraction of it. You mentioned adverse events. That's something that's there. People understanding why they're taking the medication and literally what it does in their body is really important to adherence. You mentioned access earlier. Access is a really important part of adherence. That's a lot harder to change than reminding someone to take their medication every day, right? But it's really important. So definitely there's a lot of different strategies and approaches and research that has been done in the medication adherence space using behavioral science and nudges. And it really is, I'm going to say this a lot. It comes down to the context. It comes down to knowing your audience. But, there's absolutely something that you can do. And we're all trying to crack that nut because it's a big, big issue.
So what I'm hearing you say is it's because the question is being asked wrong, we're often getting wrong answers. Because people are saying, I want to solve compliance, and that's great, or adherence, and that's great, but that's too general a goal. You've got to tackle each individual question. I guess this becomes even more complicated when you're trying to nudge people to take a vaccine, when they may have emotional reasons, because it's not cost anymore. It's not really compliance because it's a single shot or it's 2 shots right now. Mm-hmm. It's often a moral perspective. They may have a moral decision that where they think that they don't want to. So again, I don't know if you're actually advising anyone on this topic, but assuming you aren't, are you by any chance? So we don't have to touch it otherwise.
No, that's fine. We can talk about it.
Okay. What are some factors if someone was saying, you know what, I need someone to help me with this problem, how would you go about advising them to start touching that issue? How would you help them craft the question, if you will?
Yeah, so crafting the question is something that I am constantly trying to educate clients on how important it is to really spend time doing this thoughtfully. It's something that people think they've got, and they're like, yeah, I know what my problem is. I face it every day. It's a pain in my butt. Like, I know what the problem is. Yeah. Let's solve it. And so slowing down and saying, okay, we know what the general shape of the problem is, but we don't know the target that we're aiming for within that big shape, right? And so the target needs to be as specific as, I want this very specific target audience, not just, I don't want everyone to take the vaccine. Of course I do, but your intervention is going to be very different by different demographics, by different psychological profiles. There's no one size fits all on this stuff. So you need to get really specific about who you're speaking to, what their barriers are, what their levers are, and those are going to come from that behavioral economics, understanding our unconscious drivers of behavior, understanding our health behavior, health psychology theories, which also outline a lot of the constructs that help us understand and diagnose what's driving behavior. And then once you understand that, and you understand exactly what you want to see from them, then you can start to design your solutions. And understanding exactly what you want to see from them, that desired behavior, can also become, a lot more specific than people think about at first glance. You want to know the exact situation that you want them to get vaccinated in. You want them to do it on time. You want to even think about, how are they going to get there? Who are they going to go with? What are they going to do after, before? How are they going to reschedule their work around it? You start thinking about all these things, and it's like, oh, there is the invisible costs that we need to think about, especially with vaccine as well, right? I know it's free, but, I have to take a day off afterwards for the side effects if I get sick from the second dose. I have to deal with a sore arm for a couple days. All of these are worthwhile. I definitely recommend everybody get their COVID vaccine. I am as well. But it's things that you do need to think about. And for some people, that's going to be a high enough barrier that you need to figure out how to help them get around it.
That's so interesting. So the idea is, don't just think about the obvious things that you think about the underlying costs. And it sort of gets into this whole idea of social determinants of health, if you will, which is fascinating by itself. But before we go down that path, let me ask a really basic question. And the basic question is something we've seen done. Let me ask the basic question. The question is, who exactly is a behavioral scientist? Because that could, to me, That's everything from psychologists, sociologists, public health professionals. What exactly is one, and how do I find the right behavioral scientist from the outside just going, you know what, I'm going to call BVA and they'll help me?
Yeah, I mean, that would be my first answer, of course. But yeah, so who is a behavioral scientist? So this is actually something that's a little bit in flux. This is a developing field. This is new cutting edge science. So, people are getting into it, and it's kind of, we're building the plane as we fly to a certain extent, right? This is a very established scientific field, but every time you're doing a new application for, in the business world, it is new, right? Every context is unique and every audience is unique. So you need to have a little bit of an experimental mindset. But who is a behavioral scientist? Well, these are folks who are doing applied work for the most part. So, working not in academic labs necessarily. Those folks can classify themselves as behavioral scientists too, but often they're going to be psychologists or neuroscientists on top of it, right? Mm-hmm. But, I think it's one of those where if you have psychology background, if you have behavioral economics background, and you're really approaching the problem solving in such a way to take that deep understanding of human behavior and psychology into account, and then developing those solutions using kind of a scientific method, I think you can call yourself a behavioral scientist.
So what I hear you saying is, and please correct me if I'm totally misstating this, but it's the application of theories is what makes you a behavioral scientist, and what the practice you come from is less important than the work you've actually done and the results you can actually show. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yeah.
Okay.
Because we've got folks who, we've got organizational psychologists. I have a public health and psychology and medical science background by training. We've got, behavioral economists. We've got neuroscientists, just thinking about who's on the BVA nudge team, right? So that's kind of a diverse array of folks if you think about the actual academic disciplines, but we're all behavioral scientists at the end of the day.
And I'm going to ask I'm going to poke the bear, if you will. Is one group more effective than others, or is it specific to the type of work being done?
When you say one group, what do you mean?
So are neuroscientists more effective than organizational scientists compared to psychologists, or is it just depends on the question you're answering, or it doesn't depend, it's just the experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, a lot of people are advocating for a lot more cross-pollination between the disciplines, and I totally agree with that. So the more kind of different but overlapping ways of thinking that you can get at a problem, in this case, the better off you're going to be. So if we understand the neuroscience, and we understand the behavioral economics, and we understand the social psychology, and we understand the organizational psychology, you're going to be able to tackle the problem from all the relevant angles, right? Because there's no problem that you and I are going to be solving in our day-to-day work that's just a neuroscience problem, right? We are not dealing with people or problems in a vacuum. We're dealing with them in real life, and real life has a lot of influencing factors. So that kind of cross-disciplinary approach is going to be the most valuable.
So, I have more questions, but walk me through a client project. So let's pick on something. Let's talk about COVID, and we're trying to see why aren't people taking the vaccine. And in those situations, are you going, let me create a flow chart of all the reasons people wouldn't, or are you going, let me you come up with that and we'll just sort of guide you? How does this process work? Do you start from asking the question? I mean, I can think of 1,000 ways to do it, but there are probably 4 or 5 that actually work. So what is the way you actually do that?
Yeah, so there's definitely not one way that we approach every project. All of our projects are, bespoke to the situation because, again, context is king. So even if you're solving a medication adherence problem, which has been looked at a lot of times in a lot of ways, you're still looking at a specific context and a specific challenge and a specific group. So you're drawing on your previous experience, but you still need to make sure you're going deep and coming at this with fresh eyes and looking at this to try to solve for what's here and not what you already know from past experience. So in that sort of situation, yeah, you're going to draw on, if we're trying to figure out why aren't people getting the COVID vaccine, let's move them along. You're going to look at, okay, so you client, do you have existing research on barriers and levers that you already have? course, we want to use what we already have produced.
Yeah.
Most of the time, that's not going to have been done in like a really deep psychological, behavioral economics, cognitive bias type of lens, right? It's going to be more traditional market research lens. It still has its value and it's still part of the equation, but it's, that's what we're adding, right? Is that lens. So from there, often we like to try to do our own primary research to understand exactly what is holding people up and what is motivating the people who are getting the vaccine, and try to find kind of where's the overlap, where's the differences, what do we need to nudge along further in the process. And so that primary research can look a lot of different ways, depending on exactly what we're looking at. So it might be that sometimes it's appropriate to do an ethnography where we're doing observations of people using that field of expertise of watching people in their environment to understand the environmental things that are going on and the relationships and interactions that are part of what's driving people or holding people back. We also do a lot of just interviews with our target audience. And we come at these interviews, asking some of the typical questions you might expect, but often we'll also use techniques that are a little bit different to try to uncover what unconscious drivers are part of this equation as well. And so there will be projection exercises or little different kinds of questions or things that we'll do to get at those unconscious drivers of behavior. So once we've created that, do you have a question? I'll pause.
Just a quick question before you go.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah.
What is a projection exercise?
Projection exercise. Yeah, good question. So these are exercises that you'll do in a qualitative interview, usually one-on-one. And they can look at a lot of different ways, but basically they're little things that are kind of fun activities to try to get people up and out of their rational, canned answer head and to give you a little bit more insight of how do you really think. So an exercise I've done previously when I was trying to figure out with doctors, like, why do you pick this drug over that drug when there are like half a dozen drugs for you to choose from? They're all kind of equivalent. Some of them are definitely better, but maybe you're not choosing the better one. Let's find out why. And so that exercise would be, okay, so let's pretend you're at a party and drug A walks in. What are they wearing? How do they enter the party? Right? So they're going to describe the first one as like Hawaiian shirt maybe. And they're like life of the party and they're really chatting everybody up. Okay, drug B walks in. How do they enter the party? What are they wearing? Well, this guy's in like polo shirt. He's really grumpy. He's hiding in the corner, like that sort of thing. It's really fun. And, especially it's fun doing this with doctors because they're like, what are we doing? This is not rational at all. I don't want to play. But you warm people up into it. And then it reveals a lot more than just saying, what do you think about this drug? Why do you choose that drug, right? Because then you're just going to tap into what we call system 2, which is your rational brain, as opposed to system 1, which is your unconscious, really quick thinking brain. So that's a projection exercise.
Yeah, thank you. Now, could you go back to the questions? Because you talk about, because there's so much. Please continue.
So much. Yes. So phase 1 is discovery, right? So we've pulled on our existing research. We have done our own primary research that's going to be custom fit to the problem we're trying to solve, and what what is possible to do given different circumstances. And then we're going to sift through all of that with our behavioral science lens to understand, okay, so these are the things that are the real psychological drivers and the real barriers to this desired behavior. So what's really holding people back and what's really going to motivate them and help them get there. We'll then take that, and let's say we're doing this in like a workshop setting. Doesn't have to be. It might be we're just coming up with stuff and we'll let you know and work with you kind of on the back end to refine. But sometimes we'll do like co-creation workshops with the clients to really bring everybody along in the process and pull on all those different perspectives. So in that workshop, we'll feed in what are those drivers, barriers that we identified in that primary research and that discovery phase, and do a lot of ideation on really specific barriers. Like it might be like, oh, we looked at your enrollment form and you didn't pre-check that box that says, yeah, remind me for, send me a reminder, right? Maybe not everybody wants a reminder, but maybe it's better if the default is that we remind people to show up for their vaccine on time, right? Or maybe, there's literally too many pages for you to click through on your website. And so what can we do about that, right? Like these little things become very, very specific, but they can be really fun jumping off point for ideation. And so we'll do the ideation based on different behavioral science tools that we'll apply and supply to everyone on the day, depending on what we're doing. And then coming out of that, we'll have tons and tons of ideas. And so we then sort through those, refine them, build them up together to be kind of bigger superstructure ideas. And then you kind of got your approach. And so what becomes really important from there, that's usually where people think, cool, project's done. Now I'm just going to do it. And you can, and people do that. But it's best if you then make sure that you build in a test and learn phase, an evaluation phase. Because, like I said, behavioral scientists, we use the scientific method, and that accounts for measurement and refinement if you want to get the best results possible in each unique context. So make sure that we are either doing a pilot phase or we're doing some pre-testing, and then you roll it out based on the refinements that you learn from that evaluation phase. And continue to evaluate as you go, if you can.
It's a continuous improvement cycle, if you will.
Ideally.
I have a bunch of questions that came out of that. Let me start with the basic one. It sounds like you are enabling certain behaviors and sort of causing other behaviors to be not as useful. How do you react to people who've, for lack of a better term, weaponized that? And what I think when I use that term, one of the companies that always gets targeted for this is luckily not pharma as much as tech. So Facebook and the like. So Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I figured this was going to come up with you, Darshan.
I didn't realize that, but I just made that up. Sure.
No, but this comes up a lot. And I was even when I lecture at Columbia, I was just doing one of the lectures last week. Every lecture, one of the students is going to ask, what about the ethics of this? And it's a really important question. And, I'm making light of it, but it's critical, right? And we take it very seriously. But what I say to those people is, number one, there is no neutral choice architecture, right? Any way that you're going to design your form, right? For example, just take a really simple example. What's going to be at the top of the list? How many fields do people have to fill out? Like what's pre-checked and what's not? There's no neutral approach to this, right? So you may as well be really deliberate and thoughtful rather than just being kind of random or ignoring it and just assuming that that's okay. That's a bias in and of itself called omission bias, which says if I take no action, the results are not on me, even if I chose to not take that action, right? But anyway, so that's one of the first things I'll say is like, okay, well, there is no neutral way to do this. So if you're going to be the person responsible for designing any kind of program, situation, form, whatever, you may as well do it thoughtfully, which means you're using these tools, right? But for good, not evil. And the other thing is, we always encourage a co-creation approach wherever you can, where you involve your target audience in this process at some point. And that's going to be something that's also going to really help, keep things grounded in what's actually good for your target audience, right? That's why we want their voice in the room as much as you can. Not that we aren't intending that anyway, but, the best perspective is going to be that of your target audience. And then, finally, like we are always keeping ourselves in check. I have a public health background, so, I go to work trying to help people every day, even if I'm working in a slightly different kind of field. And a lot of the people that you work with are in the same boat, right? And so most of the time, it's not going to be deliberate, but you do need to have those checks and balances. You do need to keep yourselves aware. Make it part of your process to say, is this something that's really in line with our target? Right? With what they would really want. And that's why I talked about at the beginning, we like win-win-win situations, right? Not lose-win-win or lose-win-lose, whatever. But yeah, ethics are really important. It's something to always be keeping in mind. And there's lots of different ways that you can get at making sure it's on track.
So it raises the question, you said this before, but you said, I'm trying to make sure I get the sentencing correctly. You said there's no neutral version. You've got to make a decision. You've got to pick a side, if you will. And it's about just, do you sort of ignore it and you go into omission bias, or do you mindfully make certain decisions and that's okay too? I guess my question is, can nudging then be used in a way to nudge people to being more neutral? And what I mean by that is in the context of clinical trials, one of the groups you'd end up working with are the IRBs. And I apologize if I'm repeating something you already know, but you do research, you probably do know what IRBs are. But since if you're working with IRBs, one of the things you worry about all the time is at what point, what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of almost have Stockholm syndrome and start seeing things too far from what the sponsor might want you to look at from. So you want to nudge them back to what is your core value. I'm not saying that you can't do that, but you need to understand. I think the term, and it's very on DC, is going native, I guess. But in that sense, can nudging behavior be used to make people more neutral?
I mean, I think neutral is still a behavioral goal, right? So yes, is the short answer.
Okay.
But I mean, it's looking at what's the behavioral goal, what are the barriers and the levers between target A and behavioral goal, and working accordingly. I think the structure is the same.
I guess the question I have, and I'm going to challenge you on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Is neutral necessarily a behavioral goal? And what I mean by that is, didn't I implicitly basically say don't be so sponsor specific? Isn't that automatically then saying be more sponsor negative by definition?
Yeah, and so that's where we get back to that question of really drilling down on what is your behavioral target, right? Because it's really easy to say, I want them to be more neutral, right? And people think that's my behavioral target. And it's like, well, think about that for another minute. Is that a behavior? And if that is a behavior, what exactly does that behavior look like? So I would challenge you in return to say, okay, well, being more sponsor specific, what does that mean? Does that mean they reply to my emails saying such and such? Does this mean they approve this thing at this time? Like, what does that actually mean in a human is doing this thing at this time in this way? And then you're going to be able to get where you want to go.
Very, very cool. I'm going to ask one last question that we got from the audience when we started, so I apologize for the delay. But here, let me put this in. Is a country's norm going to play a vital role for anyone as behavior common sense? So does a country or does a location play into it?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that, Dinesh. And yes, so when I talk about behavioral economics and social psych and all of this stuff, we say that it is definitely based on common human brain programming, like these unconscious biases that I've kind of mentioned. This is based on basic programming that we all have, and it's designed, it's evolved, whatever, to make sure that we can approach the world in an efficient way, right? If we were consciously thinking about every single thing that we did, our brains would explode and we wouldn't get anywhere. So we need these shortcuts to make us able to cope with reality. That said, we are also still shaped by our environment, right? So we have these commonalities, we have these common shortcuts built in, but the exact way that they all manifest and the other influences on our behavior, like our social group, the social norms of our culture, these absolutely play a role. And so it's really important to make sure that whatever group or behavioral scientist you have working on your problem has a knowledge or is able to get a knowledge of your local culture, right? And so that's why we have offices all over the world. We're not just working out of New York City where I am. We've got folks in London, in Paris, in Santiago, Chile, in Singapore, with local knowledge of local people so that we can make sure we support our clients regardless of market, right? And so whenever you're approaching any kind of problem in any kind of culture, you absolutely have to take that into account. Great question.
That's awesome. So let me do a because we're already out of time, but there's so much more we could discuss.
I know, we just got started.
We just got started. Let me ask you a quick question. What's a question for the audience you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I mean, the question I like to ask people, just because I'm really curious and I love this stuff, is kind of where are you at with your behavioral science journey, either as an individual or as an organization? How much are you aware of this? How much do you use it? How does what I'm saying mesh with just your lived experience? I think once this is explained, a lot of it is intuitive, but it's interesting to kind of apply it in a deliberate way. So I'm curious what folks in your audience know about this and how they're using it already, if in any way.
Very cool. I'm gonna do a quick sum. Oh, actually, one more question. I'm gonna ask you the typical questions we like to ask our audience. I'm gonna ask you 3 rapid fire questions. Would that be okay?
Please do.
Okay. When are you most inspired?
When am I most inspired? I got to say that flow state, when you have a real good, you're zoned in, you know exactly where you're trying to get, and you're able to kind of pull on all the different models that you've got in your brain. And you're like, yes, I love being able to kind of combine things in a way that's really strategic and interesting.
Very cool. How do you define success?
How do I define success? I think going back to that win-win-win, right? When, we've achieved our goals as a business, our clients have achieved theirs, we are doing something that's aligned with our target audience. A lot of times that is the case in healthcare. Like most people want to be healthy and take their medication. It can be hard, right? Life is hard. So when we're doing something that's aligned with everyone's goals, and when we're able to do something that serves society on a broader level, that's what makes me feel successful.
Very cool. Last one. What's your kryptonite?
Kryptonite? Ooh, tricky. That's a deep question.
Okay.
I'm sure there's a list. I think it can be getting too deep into the weeds and forgetting that strategic level, right? I'm a strategist as well. And so it's finding the right balance of teeny tiny little nudges, and am I sticking with the strategy, or am I going down this rabbit hole? And it can be really fun to get stuck in the rabbit hole area, but you got to remember to kind of balance the way that your brain is thinking about things as well.
Very cool. So I'm going to do a quick summary. During this podcast, we really talked about what is behavioral health, how is that different from traditional economics, and you sort of explained traditional economics, choice architecture, the concept of nudging. You talked about where do you actually find a behavioral scientist, if you will. We got into the sort of overall general process of doing some studies into what is a solution that's right for you. So you talked about the discovery, ideation, and test and learn phases. And you talked about system 1 and system 2, which is unconscious brain and the conscious brain. And what I thought was really interesting, which was the idea that there's no neutral. And it's something we get taught all the time in law school, where we get told that you can't find an unbiased judge. Every judge will have their biases. The question really is, which ones can you live with? In the same sense, there's no neutral. You've got to pick. There will be a side to pick. I had so many more questions to get into, but I think this is just the first question we're going to get into. Did I miss anything?
No, I think, we covered a lot, and you are a wonderful host and you're tracking amazingly. So it's been a real pleasure to talk with you. And yeah, we definitely got so many more things we could cover, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, Darshan. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. So again, just to clarify, nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal, behavioral science, or clinical advice of any kind. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only, and this was highly entertaining. For those of you who missed it, where can they find you again?
You can find me on LinkedIn, or please email me at suzanne.kirkendall@bvanudgeunit.com.
And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me at Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Again, Suzanne, thank you so much.
Thank you.